Welcome to the Leadership Zone. It's great to have you join me again. One of the things that I've noticed since publishing Inclusive Leadership, Navigating Organisational Complexity, is that people are saying, yes, but, and this is quite common in leadership where we say, okay, that's great in theory, Sheila, we get it, but what about in this situation? And so I'm going to incorporate some of those situations more frequently into my conversations and into the podcast. So today's one is quite a common one, which is how do you handle difficult people? And this comes up time and time again around leadership. They say, look, I can do all best practice all day long. I don't have issues with other people. I can do this really well. But then a difficult person gets in the way and they make it more difficult. And there's a couple of thoughts I have about this. And I just want to say there's always difficult people, right? Or people we find difficult, as you'll learn that I'm going to talk about it in a sec. But there's also a piece here around the fantasy that everybody's going to get on track and that everybody's going to kind of pull together and behave in the way you expect them to. The reality is that you probably wouldn't have a job, whether you're a leader or a manager or you supervise, if people pull together with ease. The purpose of leadership and management roles is to help people pull together in one direction. And so while I understand it can be deeply frustrating, it's very important to remember that your role exists usually to help people that are difficult to work with or that others find difficult, to kind of influence them and help them move forward and help them add value to the task at hand. So that's the first thing, is that we have to start with that fantasy, that Melanie Klein fantasy, that difficult people are a problem and that they shouldn't exist. Difficult people exist. That's often why our jobs exist in organizations. And it's okay that you find someone difficult. It's okay that they feel like they're blocking everything for you. You might not like it. You might wish it was different. All of those things are valid. But if we start with the situation that it's wrong and it's a problem and they're the problem, it's not a great place to start because there's no kind of real solution bar get rid of them. So when I hear people talk about getting rid of people, I often think, well, you probably haven't thought about your other options as well as you think you have. And in my experience, very, very rarely is getting rid of someone really the solution. Now, I'm going to put a little caveat because I work with government departments and civil servants and public servants, and in Ireland, in the UK, and in different parts of Europe. Depending on the system of hiring and how secure people are in unions and things like that, then there might be a situation where you can't actually get rid of someone anyway, or you might be limited in your intervention. So there's some other things that we can think about. So the first thing is to say it's perfectly normal, okay, not disastrous if there's a difficult person. But more importantly, if we reframe that sentence from difficult person to a person I find difficult, we change the power. And I'm not being pedantic because I hate people that go on about, I hate when people go on about wordplay and stuff. As a dyslexic, words don't hold the same position for me as they do for others. Like something can be expressed in multiple words, whereas someone else might be very precise with their words. Or, say, oh no, this word only means this. Whereas just as a dyslexic, for me, it's the essence of words. It's the spirit behind the word I'm using rather than the word. So I don't get pedantic on words, but this is more than that. When I say it's a difficult person, then the only option is I accept that they're difficult and let what's happening continue, or I get rid of them. And it's a typical fight or flight kind of response. It's a typical defense response. But when we see a person as difficult, we place the problem in them. And because we can't change other people, it leaves us a little bit powerless, unless we either accept it and are frustrated, or we reject them, get rid of them, avoid them, whatever other approach you utilize. But when we shift to, I find this person difficult, there's a couple of things happening. One is we're placing the issue between me and the other person. So that means that there's more options available, which we'll talk about in a moment. But also we're acknowledging that something within us is finding that difficult. And so that means that we now also personally have more options, because I can work through, or you can work through, what you're finding personally difficult, which will help you have clarity about your expectations, whether they're reasonable or not. And even if they're reasonable, whether they're achievable or not, you'll be able to understand if there's extra energy or grit behind the situation that it's triggering other experiences that you've had before, or it's rubbing you up the wrong way. You'll be able to kind of think about your own process. But when you say that the other person's difficult, what we often unconsciously start to think about is, what can I do to the other person? We often think about how I can control them or move them. So unfortunately, that then leads us to all sorts of power struggles. But if we were able to say that I find this person difficult, and then we're able to say why, first of all, you find this person difficult. That's really helpful because now you're holding your own power and your own situation, and you understand what you're bringing to the dynamic. The second step that can be really powerful is when you place it between you and them. So I'm finding this person difficult. You can start to think about what's happening in the situation rather than simply they are a difficult person. You can think, why am I finding this person difficult? What are they doing? So remember, in workplaces, we can engage and we can rectify what they're doing. We can address things that people say, and we can address how they do tasks. So if you're saying, oh, what are they doing that I'm finding difficult? And you can find language for that, you're already further along than if you just say that they're a difficult person. Because when you say that they're just a difficult person, well, unless you either get rid of the person or change the person, you're stuck. But when you're thinking about what they're doing that you're finding difficult and you find words for it, you can also then find strategies around handling it or dealing with what they're doing that you're finding difficult. Now, this doesn't mean that you're going to solve everything or that you're going to get 100% the outcome that you want. But what it does mean is that you can reduce the blame and shame that you utilize. You can reduce the win or lose mentality that you're bringing to the situation. You can reduce your own frustration because you're processing why you find the situation difficult personally. And then you can deal with the situation as a behavioral, relational thing that's happening between you and the other person, which means it's easier to call things out. So an example of this would be somebody would say, oh, this person is so difficult. They always say no to everything, right? They're so difficult. They're so negative. I hear things like that all the time. And because that's the position that you're holding or I'm holding, it means that the other person, no matter what they say or do, are going to we're going to keep finding evidence for our position ultimately, right? So we're going to find evidence that they are difficult, that they're always saying no. But if I say, okay, I'm finding this person difficult and I know why I'm personally finding them difficult, and then I'm able to look at the work and say, okay, well, what in the work are they doing that is making it difficult to work with them? And then I might be able to say, well, actually, I noticed that any new idea they always say no to. And then as a coach, I might say to the leader who says that, do they say no to every idea or just ideas suggested to them? Oh, all ideas. Okay, so that's a piece of data. Or sometimes the leader will say, oh, I actually know their own ideas they agree to, but just not ours. And I say, okay, well, then there's a new choice. How can you help them come up with ideas that solve these problems so that they are less likely to resist, for instance? The other thing that can happen when we see it as finding the person difficult is we can start to think about what their unmet needs are. Do they have needs that you can easily identify? Like, do they need to be seen as good enough? Do they need to control? Do they need to be considered? There's loads of needs, right? But then you might also want to consider, what do they want? So some people will want to maintain power. Some people won't want to do anything. But if we can see that the situation exists between us and that we are finding them difficult, we're more likely to identify some motivating needs that they're experiencing. And what this means then is we have some choices, because there might be alternative ways to meet these needs that we hadn't considered because we're busy arguing over the bins or something, or arguing over how a project is done, that we're actually missing why the other person is holding that position. And therefore, we're not actually able to help them solve the position and move forward in terms of the work. I'm not talking about being anyone's counselor or psychologist here. What I'm talking about is when you are trying to motivate people and engage people as a leader, you do need to understand, especially when you're finding someone difficult, what their unmet needs are, what their motivations are. And we do need to be able to have those conversations with people. Now, obviously, depending on who it is, you need to mediate that and manage that in different ways. But the idea of they are difficult versus I'm experiencing them difficult, I find them difficult to deal with. The biggest difference is you only have two options with the first one. But when I talk about this third option, the options are nearly infinite about what you can consider and what you can do. And so it's really important that you're thinking about, rather than labeling people as difficult people, that you're understanding what's behind their behavior and you're understanding what behavior you might want to stop or continue. Because often when people say, oh, they're just difficult, what ends up happening is you can't address that. You can't say to someone, you're just a difficult person. Well, you can, but it's not very effective as a manager or leader. But what you can do is you can say, I encourage you to reflect on things before you reject them, or I would like if you were more proactive or supportive or positive in this interaction. So you can make requests that may not solve the situation straight away, But as time goes on, these requests, you can then measure whether they're achieving them or not. And remember that the requests have to be within the boundaries of a workplace. So it has to be about how they're communicating or what they're communicating, how they're behaving or, what behaviors they're engaging with. And it also needs to be about how they do their job. So those three things we can talk to people about all day long. But usually what happens is because we haven't broken them down and we don't give people the direct feedback about behavior or communication, what ends up happening is it almost becomes difficult to pinpoint or discuss. And so it's easier just to say that person is difficult than it is to unpack why you're finding that person difficult. Now, if you unpack why you're finding that person difficult, you're going to have more strategies. You're going to personally be more regulated and capable of being present with the person as they are, rather than getting into a dynamic or a reactiveness with them. But you're also going to have other options about how you're going to work with them, including responsibility. Are they frustrated because actually there's a historic situation that hasn't been resolved and now they acted out everywhere? Are they frustrated because you didn't fulfill a promise or an obligation to them and therefore their feelings are valid and you might need to work with them? Are you finding them difficult to work with because actually they're just a different person to you, different style? And so actually you want everyone to do things like you. Like there are so many possibilities when we find someone difficult to work with. And the worst thing is when somebody says to me, Sheila, everyone finds them difficult. Because the odds are high that while they may be difficult to deal with for you or for other people, that you're almost defaulting to that stereotype because it's easier than considering how you're interacting with them and finding a way through. And from a psychological perspective, we would kind of use this approach as it falls under mentalization quite a bit. And from a leadership perspective, it falls under how do you motivate, connect, and enable performance of others. Whereas often when we say that somebody is difficult, we are unconsciously limiting their competence and their performance to some degree because we're not giving them the positive regard that would allow them to flourish. We're now defaulting to a position that's merely very difficult to change. And so when you find yourself saying, this person is really difficult, even if it is true, even if everybody agrees with you, you have more opportunities for solutions if you move to the I statement of, I find this person difficult. Because now you're taking responsibility for your part in the dynamic and what you can do. You're taking responsibility for identifying how that difficulty manifests in behavior and in conversation and in different settings. And now you have something you can give feedback on and create accountability around. Whereas traditionally, when we do that default, we don't have those steps. And therefore, it's very hard to utilize that experience in feedback or in KPIs or in annual reviews. So whenever you find yourself saying that person is difficult, it is really powerful to say, I'm finding that person difficult, and think about what is happening for you personally, what you might need to regulate and manage. Think about what is happening between you and that person. So behavior, conversations, attitude, whatever it is that is triggering you, get clear about that. And then the next step is what is reasonable for the professional setting, for the setting you're in, to ask them to do differently. Because unless you're asking them to do things differently in small steps, you're going to get an accumulation of behavior that you're not happy with. But also, if you're asking people to change behavior and they don't, you can now create some accountability around it. Whereas just deciding that they're a difficult person, first of all, is deciding that there's no opportunity for change. And I don't mean the person changing, but your relationship, your dynamic, your feelings about the situation can't change. Whereas if we take that second approach, you have choices and options. And also it fits really well into a workplace setting because you have the ability to create a measurement of if you are making requests and they're not achieving them or they're undermining them, you now can have an evidence-based conversation about their behavior and the impact of it, rather than a conversation which you are dysregulated, angry, frustrated, upset, whatever you're feeling, and they are holding their position. So it's just this power struggle of which you are losing power because you're not actually identifying your own power by saying, why is this having this impact on me? And unpacking that. And then thinking about your power in the situation, which is what's a reasonable request, what's appropriate feedback, all of those things. And I just want to be clear, there is a difference between saying somebody's a difficult person and you attempting all of these things and you being bullied. And I just want to be clear because I remember teaching a class a few years ago. And in the conversation, someone said, I think I need to do this process that you're talking about, what's happening for me, da, 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 da. And as they described the situation, I said, pause, that's not an appropriate situation to do, because it's really evident you're being bullied by the definition under Irish law. So definition is an incident that happens more than once that undermines you in terms of your dignity. Okay. And when that person heard that, I said, this approach, if you attempt this, you will have like options. You'll be able to make some choices about, addressing the behavior. That middle process between you and them is still appropriate. But the difference is when there is bullying or discrimination and an abuse of power of that nature, then actually it's really important to address that directly. And what I mean by directly is, I mean, not to mislabel it as like personality differences or, or maybe I'm just not communicating clearly, or maybe I'm difficult to work with. And these are good questions to reflect on, because you want to make sure that you're not labeling everything as bullying or abuse or discrimination, because you're not looking at your part in the dynamic or your narrative. You don't want to get into that situation. And the main reason being that when you get into that situation, you can lose credibility in a workplace if you're engaging and actually it's really evident that your position is always to blame outwards rather than to look at your role in it. But in the situation where that's not your go-to default, then if you are seeing a repeated undermining of your dignity that you can see and you'd say, yeah, that's really not appropriate behavior, that middle ground of addressing the behavior is still appropriate. But I don't want you to spend a long time unpacking your own stuff, because that would require a therapist and support. So I just want to say there's a difference between finding people difficult to deal with and being in a dynamic that's abusive. And I just always call that out because it's really interesting. Often people who are in abusive dynamics will assume the first situation that they must do all the work and unpack everything because that's how it works. But then also people who might default to blame might be less likely to look at their own process. And look, we all have kind of preferences. So, as in like the things we default to. So my main encouragement is, if you're finding someone difficult, it is worth understanding why. So that's the starting point. If you can say, I'm finding them difficult because, and you can see that there's a clear overt abuse of power that falls under bullying rather than just disagreement or different worldviews or different experiences, then that requires you to think about a more in-depth process and maybe better supports. If you're looking at a situation and you're like, yeah, it's not bullying, I find them really difficult, they really annoy me, then it's really worth going down the route of saying, okay, well, what is it in me that's being triggered by this? What is it that's happening between us that I can name, identify, and address? And then what is my follow through? So how am I going to ensure that I'm not avoiding certain situations or moments that will allow us to have follow through? So what can happen is we can say, right, well, I'm going to call the person and say, I don't want this behavior. And then you do that. And you say, I want this behavior. And you do that. And then when they don't behave that way, you slowly let it slip. In workplaces, follow through is nearly as important as the starting line, the statement, the policy. Because if you don't follow through on it, it doesn't come to life. It isn't experienced. It doesn't have power. Stating something and following through are very different things. And so the next time you find yourself going, oh, they're really difficult, I ask you to say, I find them really difficult, and think about why. And there are some exercises on the website, and the links are below, that you can utilize to maybe unpack and reflect on what's happening and find a way forward. I hope that was helpful. I'd love to hear your thoughts. You know that you can ask a question in the question piece below. So if you have any questions you'd like me to address in future podcasts, you can hashtag ILNOC to join the conversation about inclusive leadership. And you can tag me at Sheila Walsh1 on any platform and to start a conversation. Let me know what you think, and don't forget to rate and review this podcast episode. Thank you for joining me.